In the book, Guiding K-3 Writers to Independence, The New Essentials, edited by Pat Scharer and me. We're continuing to talk about Chapter 8, Writing About Reading, written by me, Su Pinnell, and Irene Fountas. In the first segment, we talked in general about writing about reading, what it is, and what the benefits would be. In this segment, I'd like to talk about several genres for writing about reading and some of the benefits of it. There are many genres for writing about reading. I'll just talk about a few of them here. The first one I would like to talk about is summarizing. Writing about reading gives the young writer the chance to summarize the ideas that he has read. Look at this piece of writing about reading. And this piece of writing about reading was produced using interactive writing with a group of children. And they're just telling about some events in a story, a kind of summary of part of the action. Bunny hopped under the fence, she heard a noise, she hopped into a hole. That's what happened in that episode in the story. And by putting it down in writing, they're reflecting back on it, and they're able to notice the sequence of events. You notice that this piece of writing about reading provided opportunity for some individual children to come up to the chart or easel and say a word slowly and write some words. Now, some of the words like the teacher has written because they're well known to all of the children, but there was attention in this piece to the SH and to that OI vowel structure in noise, and to the double letters in hopped. And so children are taking on some new knowledge of the way words work. At the same time, they're always thinking in their minds about what happened in that story and the sequence of events. So it's a very simple example of writing about reading that helps them put into words and record what they think about a text. Let's go to a much more sophisticated example. This example is produced through shared writing. So in this case, the teacher was writing on a chart, but the students were composing what was said. It's about a beginning chapter book about a biography of Eugenie Clark, who studied sharks and is a very interesting scientist. And what you see is a kind of essence of each chapter. So after chapter 1, they wrote what happened in chapter 1 in just one sentence. Chapter 2, Eugenie Clark decided to set up her own fish tank to observe fish and take notes about them. So by the time they finish this simple chapter book about Eugenie Clark, they will have produced a summary for each chapter that helps them keep in mind what happened in the story. Now, this helps the memory of what happened in the story. It frees their minds to think about things like not just I'll remember what happened, but what were the decisions that Eugenie Clark made along the way in her life that got her to the point where she is. That's the whole point of a biography. It isn't just a story that happened, like an inevitable story. Anyone who's worth writing a biography about has made some critical decisions and points along the way. The fascination of biography is being able to figure out what kind of person this was. Why did they succeed? What led them in the direction that they wanted to go so that they were able to accomplish whatever the biographer thought was important. That all figures into the thinking about that genre. And this kind of summarizing just provides a foundation so students can then begin to talk about Eugenie Clark and why she got so interested in sharks and has stayed with it all these years. And it will also help them go back and produce evidence from the text that will help them support their statements and their thinking. So the writing about reading acts as a kind of help in terms of memory and grounding it in the text. Look at the next example. This is a sequential account of how a road is made. And the book they're working from is a nonfiction book, that starts with just a field with trees, and people want to put a road through, and so it tells the steps along the way. A machine cuts the trees down, a machine puts away rocks and tree stumps, and so this long, complicated process that goes from that very beginning where they decide to put the road in and they start to create the path for the road, all the way to the machine puts on the blacktop. So it goes from field of trees to road, and here sequence is extremely important in the process. And so the reader of this text needs to understand that this is a temporal sequence, a sequence of steps in time. You have to remember them in order. You have to think about them in order. And this kind of writing about reading acts as a memory for that and helps you really see the idea of temporal sequence. Next, I'd like to talk about the role of writing about reading in helping students learn about text structure. Now, text structure refers to the way the text is organized. And they're different, they get more and more complex, and we even find that the factor of text structure, organization, the presentation of information is sometimes different for the different disciplines, like biology and chemistry and history. So they're even at those very high levels of complexity, you'll find text structure is a factor in the reader's understanding. For young readers, a basic understanding is that fiction is different in important ways from nonfiction. And a lot of times they're organized differently. Fiction usually has a beginning, some characters, there are events, there's a problem to be solved, they resolve the problem, and there's an end. It's a narrative structure. Now, some nonfiction texts are also narrative structure. For example, biography, or accounts of history, or even something like The Road Builders, which will have a beginning and an end. But fundamentally, informational text is often organized differently. Information is presented in categories, and sometimes as they get more complex, you have headings and subheadings and sub-subheadings to signal the reader that there are different categories of information. Sometimes in an informational text, it doesn't matter which part you read first. If you're reading about a country, you might go to the food, to the produce, to the climate, to the geography, to the history, and you could go in a different order according to your interest. This is where a table of contents and an index become important research tools, don't they? So that's a fundamental difference in text structure, and it helps us kind of understand the text structure as a feature. This is something students must learn to notice about texts, because it's really related to the way we comprehend text, to the way we access information. So thinking about text structure in informational texts also, there are some underlying text structures that writers often use, and I'll just name a few. For example, writers of informational text use compare and contrast, how things are alike, how they're different. That's kind of a structure. Often you'll find whole books organized around compare, contrast. They use temporal sequence, as in building the roads. One are steps in giving directions. Recipes are temporal sequence. It matters the order. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Sometimes they're even numbered. And so temporal sequence is very important. If you read a biography, often it will be in a temporal sequence, although sometimes it might start with the end of someone's life or their accomplishments and then flashback to different points. So there are complexities even to that. Informational writers use description. They tell what something looks like, sounds like, feels like. That's very often. Informational writers use problem solution. Here's the problem, here's like environmental pollution or something, here's how to solve it, or how someone did solve it. Problem solution. Now, writers of fiction also sometimes use compare, contrast, and problem solution, but we see these most clearly in informational texts. And informational writers use cause and effect. Now, we want our readers to notice things like problem solution, cause, effect. Look at this very simple example. This is about a book about a panda who's born in a zoo, and she's very tiny at the book actually starts when Panda's 1 year old, and then it flashes back to when she's a tiny little pink panda. And so the teacher has actually structured this writing about reading to ask students to write and draw about when Panda was born and when Panda was 1, going from baby to present. And that helps them to kind of crystallize that idea of change before and after. Another thing that writing about reading can do is help students understand text features. You know, writers, particularly in informational books, will use things like graphs, charts, headings, and subheadings to help the reader. And we want our writers of informational texts to not only notice those, but begin to use them themselves. A really simple example is shown in Julia's paper here about a police car. It was a little book about the different parts of a police car, and it had interesting graphics. It had labels in the pictures, and it would have little insets in the book. So it's a very simple informational book. And what she has done is used her book as a resource. She's written a sentence, and this was a sentence that was dictated to the group of children. So the teacher's taking the opportunity to help them write and then again read and reread a more complex sentence than they would usually write from the book, and then they've used their book as a resource to go in and label the different parts of a police car. In the next example, a very common kind of book that young children read had to do with the frog laying eggs, which grow as tadpoles, and then the tadpoles grow to look like frogs. And in this piece of shared writing, the teacher and children have composed that temporal sequence to help them understand the life cycle of the frog. So it's getting again the idea of the features of the structure of the text. And if you look at the next example, they have done their own life cycle diagram. And this is something after the children had they had read the text, they had discussed the text, they had written shared writing to write the sequence, and then the teacher could then give them this graphic organizer. They can use the book as a resource to spell the words, to notice the different points in the life cycle of the frog, and then to draw to illustrate that life cycle. So this gives them a map of that story, and at the same time they're participating in creating the kind of feature that appears often in informational texts. We also want to mention one other kind of writing about reading that we have found to be particularly effective, and that is the use of a dialogue journal. For books, any books children have heard read aloud, certainly books they're reading for independent reading, and books that even they read in guided reading, that they would write one thoughtful letter a week to the teacher about their reading. And this letter is not a regurgitation of what they've read about. It's not a book report. It's not a retelling. Do we want them to use evidence from the text to support their points? Sure. But this letter is a communication between the children and the teacher. So this is independent work that the student does during the time set aside for a reading workshop. And the letter is directed to the teacher. The teacher reads the letters written once a week and writes a brief and sometimes longer answer to the students. So by the end of the year, there's been a letter back and forth every week, just talking about reading. And the teacher can ask students questions and the students answer them. That can happen both ways. They're supposed to write what they're thinking about, what they're feeling about their reading, what they understand about it, what they puzzle about it. And this becomes quite a wonderful teaching tool. Here's a simple example from a young student. I believe this is about a second grader. Here we won't expect every word to be spelled conventionally, but the words the student does know should be proofread, and those should be conventional spelling. So it says, "Dear Miss A, I just read a book called The Carrot Seed. It is about a boy that plants a little carrot seed, and all his family sees it, says it will never come up, but it grows a big carrot. It shows that you can never predict the future. The end. Wouldn't you love to get a letter like that from a child who'd read The Carrot Seed? And it gives you this great opportunity to respond with your own thinking about predicting the future. Now, he does have a little retelling of the story, enough to sort of support his point, but the important point of it is that last statement: you can never predict the future. So he's really sort of thinking about this very simple book, The Carrot Seed. Most of us are familiar with that book. I have a more sophisticated letter, and I'd like to read this letter to you, and you just listen. It'll be up on your screen. And afterwards you can have some conversation about what Jackie is showing us about herself as a reader and also about a writer. Dear Mrs. Seeley, just to let you know, I've been writing any descriptive language that I come across in my new writer's notebook. Now that's from Writer's Workshop. So she has a reader's notebook she's writing letters to her teacher in, and she has a writer's notebook that she's using to record thoughts in Writing Workshop. Most of it is from A Year Down Yonder. Here's some of the descriptive language. And here she's quoting from this book, A Year Down Yonder. Grandma, who didn't know how to drive an automobile, aimed at the tree and hit it dead on, ramming it with the tire over the radiator. The tree reeled in shock and pecans rained. Now, why would Jackie select that piece of language? I guess it's the wonderful descriptive images that this writer is using. Here's another. Behind us, the town was like a little island of sighing trees and rising chimney smoke. Before us, the countryside unfolded, silvered by frost and moonlight. We parted the party like the Red Sea. That there is the skinniest girl I ever saw. She could rest in the shade of a clothesline. This language is so descriptive, and it's so funny too. So that's Jackie talking again about why she has selected this language to become part of her repertoire. She goes on. My favorite character so far, and most probably will be at the end, is Grandma Dowdle. She is the funniest character I've ever come across in my reading. All the funny language comes from Grandma talking. She sets things up for reasons, and if you don't know the reason, she seems crazy. But she's like Robin Hood in some ways. Like when she raised the prices for the soup only for the people she knows can afford it, and gives the money back with the soup for those who can barely afford it. And at the end of her plan, the money goes to a woman whose husband died, doesn't work, and son is paralyzed from war and can't work. Grandma is tough and rough on the outside, but soft and caring on the inside. And that's letting you know that Jackie is thinking deeply about the characters in this book, and she provides evidence for what she thinks about this wonderful character, Grandma Dowdle. Back to her letter. Here's how she finishes. I do think it's fascinating that you can use other writers' language and sometimes become a better writer using it. And it is fascinating to learn from real authors that way. I just love to read and find language worthy enough to put in my writer's notebook and use in later publishings. Well, better get back to my reading now. Oh, and A Year Down Yonder is a must read book. Happy reading, Jackie. So you may want to stop and, talk about how Jackie is showing us is that she is reading like a writer. She sees herself as a writer. She's probing the treasure, not just to imitate, although all of us imitate a little bit sometimes when we're learning to write, but looking deeply into the characters of a book and thinking, how can this be part of my own work and my own writing? Some ideas. I'll just end by listing some ideas for writing about reading, and you can read our chapter and see more. Notes and sketches we've talked about. Sometimes just drawing is really, really helpful to students in extending their thinking prior to entering into a discussion with others. Short writes. You want students to be able to respond quickly. It's great help for test taking, where that's often required, to just have students, after reading aloud or after guided reading, just quickly write what you're thinking about this piece of writing. Write a paragraph, quickly write what you think about a character, quickly write how you think the problem should be solved, so that they get accustomed to putting their ideas down quickly. We saw a couple of graphic organizers in these examples. There are more in our chapter. Graphic organizers can be overdone. They're not supposed to be handed out just as a worksheet, but they can be very helpful. A graphic organizer for compare-contrast, for a life cycle, for temporal sequence, all kinds of things like that. Written dialogue is very, very powerful, and sometimes you can even have students write dialogue to each other and pass notes back and forth about what they think about a text. Remember that dialogue with you, it probably will give the most lift to their thinking, but they enjoy written dialogue. Writing letters to an author makes that author come alive, and many, many children's authors have websites now that make it quite easy. You might not always get a response, but sometimes you do. And I think, helping students understand when they really write what they're thinking about the writer's work, then that's when they're most likely to get a response. Responding to the language of a text, sometimes, especially for older children, teachers will put a quote from the book, like some of those Jackie picked out, and then have students just write a short response that what does that language make you think about. Students can compare elements of a text, compare the beginning and end, compare one setting with another setting, compare one character with another character. That's easy to do. You can do it in chart form, or you can do it just in paragraphs. Writing a summary is always helpful, as mentioned. And students also like to write book recommendations. They can do it in a very formal way, and you can have a little section of your classroom where they clip their book recommendation right to the book, like a little book review. And of course, the books that kids like to read are those that their classmates have read and recommended. Something that's growing in popularity is writing cartoons or turning some parts of text into graphic illustrations with speech bubbles or sparer text, but information in the cartoons or the graphics. And of course, as you know, graphic novels are becoming really popular with older elementary children and up through high school. So this graphic element is very appealing. And another good way to go into some writing about reading with older children is to begin to produce some pieces of reader's theater. You can take any part of a book and select the dialogue or the narration that would be most exciting. It doesn't have to be the whole book. It can be an exciting part, a funny part, and they have to be very selective about the language when they do that, and then it's really fun to perform reader's theater. So those are just some specific ideas for writing about reading that you may want to put to use. Remember that writing about reading can happen in several different contexts. It can be part of interactive read aloud or a follow-up to it. It can be part of shared and performed reading. It can be part of guided reading as independent work or right there in the lesson. And it can be part of students' independent reading. Often when we talk about writing in terms of standards or curriculum, writing in response to reading is part of that. We've pulled it out because we think it's so important that it should go on in other contexts. So have fun with writing about reading, and we hope you enjoy our chapters.